Arlington mission that we sponsor. We need one person to go up on Thursday of this week to help with the serving of food. If you're interested, do you have anybody yet, Mike? Okay. There's only 2 more people for the 30th. Good. Okay, so we got this week taken care of. That gives us a little more time. We got a few more weeks between now and the 30th. We do need a couple of more people, 2 more people to work on the 30th. So don't worry about this week. It's covered. 2 more people on April the 30th, and we'll be good for the month of April. Also, if you're interested in our grief support group, see Mike. We're going to try to get it started back up here pretty shortly. So if you need any information, he'll be happy to give you information on that. So let's get started this evening. This is part 7 of our Old Testament survey. We're going to look at the divided kingdom. Specifically tonight, we're going to look at how the kingdom became divided. So we're going to start and talk a little bit about David, but mostly towards the end of his life. And we're going to start talking then about Solomon, a few of the things that Solomon did, and then look at where the division actually occurred. So I'm going to be giving you a lot of passages this evening. I'm going to be reading some rather lengthy passages because we really need to give an understanding. I also want to help you understand the composition of the middle part of the Old Testament, and in my opinion, why it kind of reads the way that it does. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But we're going to look first at, again, the historical narratives of the Hebrew people in the Promised Land are 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Now, 1st and 2nd Samuel are primarily focused on the period right before the first king was put into place, and that would be Saul. And then it historically follows his reign. And then it talks a lot about David. So 1st and 2nd Samuel, I think, primarily is focused on David becoming king and David's reign as king. There is information, though, about David in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. But then all the other kings are covered as well historically. So that's where we find the historical narrative of all the kings that came after Solomon. Also, the vast majority of Solomon's actions are found in 1st Kings and 1st Chronicles. Now, 2 of the things you have, I'm only going to refer to them once tonight, is the map and the chart. And these you'll need for the next few weeks. I just wanted to kind of introduce them tonight. So as we get to the end of tonight's lesson, we'll see that the kingdom becomes divided. It becomes divided into what is referred to as the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom is often referred to as Judah, although it also included one other tribe, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. But the northern kingdom was made up of 10 tribes, and it was commonly known as Israel. So on the map you'll notice in the top section, the little purple type section, it says Israel. The little, is that teal or green? I don't know, something like that at the bottom. That's titled as Judah. And that's how the nation divided up right after Solomon died. This is how the kingdom divides. So we'll talk about how they got to that point and what happened that caused the division. And that will be what we're studying going forward. So when you're looking at 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, the majority of the historical narrative covers both the northern and the southern kingdom, Israel and Judah. At that point, Israel and Judah become 2 different places with different kings. And that's where the chart comes in handy, because the chart then shows you who the king of Israel is and who the king of Judah is over the different periods of time that are covered in the historical narratives. And it even tells you where in the historical narratives the record of their lives is found. So this is an amazing resource for studying if you want to study the different kings, or if you're reading about a king and you're not quite sure when he reigned, just go back into here and it will show you where in these historical narratives you can find them. Now, rather than me going through all that, this is a survey. We don't go very deep on anything. I'm just giving you the information. So this is how your Old Testament is structured. 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles are historical narratives. Up to a point, the death of Solomon, they cover one united kingdom. After Solomon, the kingdom is divided, and historical narratives cover Israel and Judah. No longer is Israel one united country. Whenever you see the term Israel after Solomon's death, it's referring to the northern kingdom alone. When you see the reference to Judah, it's the southern kingdom. So let's get into why the people split. And I think also let's talk about a few things that are a little bit confusing in the Old Testament. One of the Old Testament books that is probably the most confusing to people is the book of Ecclesiastes. How many of you here have read Ecclesiastes? Do you find it a little confusing? Let me explain to you why you find it confusing and why you shouldn't. Does that sound like a fair challenge? Okay. Here's the reason why you find it confusing. Let me just read a portion to you tonight. Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Let's start with verse 12. So I turned to consider wisdom, madness, and folly. For what will the man do who will come after the king except what has already been done? And I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I know that one fate befalls them both. Then I said to myself, as is the fate of the fool, it will also befall me. Why then have I been extremely wise? So I said to myself, this too is vanity, and vanity is a euphemism for empty or meaningless. So there is no lasting remembrance of the wise man as with the fool, inasmuch as in the coming days all will be forgotten, and how the wise man and the fool alike die. So I hated life, for the work which had been done under the sun was grievous to me, because everything is futility and striving after wind. Wow. Is that one depressed dude or what? Not only is that one depressed man, that's also one very confused man who happened to be named Solomon. And a lot of people get to this part and they're reading this, and this is written towards the end of Solomon's life, and they're like, what in the world is this? How is this inspired? Well, Solomon, we're going to show you in just a moment, was not a very good king. In fact, he was probably their worst king of all time. He did a lot of really bad things, made a lot of terrible decisions, and caused a great deal of harm to God's people. We'll kind of break it down a little bit and look at it, but if you really want to understand why the kingdom became divided, this is the guy who did it. This is the man who led the people to separate and wage war against each other. And we'll show you why. We'll actually show you what the biblical narrative says, and it'll all kind of make sense. So when you're reading your Bible, you have the historical narratives. You have a few other little books tucked in that are historical narratives but cover later periods, like Nehemiah and Esther. So don't get those confused. They cover later periods, and they're also historical narratives as well. But then you get into what are called the wisdom books, like Psalms and Proverbs. Psalms, the vast majority of which was written by David. David, being a man after God's own heart, loved God, and he wrote these amazing songs that the Spirit of God inspired him to write, and most of those songs are songs of praise and thanksgiving. Almost everyone at least includes some form of praise and thanksgiving. Some are laments where he's grieving and he's crying out to God for mercy and direction. Some are actually prayers. So you kind of have to look at each psalm, but the vast majority are just songs. They were set to music. They became part of a songbook that the Hebrew people sang as a way to express their love and their devotion to God. Proverbs, wisdom sayings. Now, some of those were written by Solomon, but some were written by others. And again, the Spirit of God giving wisdom to men so that they could share that wisdom with us. And they're just that. They're wisdom, words of wisdom. They give you little ideas, little thoughts that will help you to find truth and then live in it. I love the Proverbs because I like those little short statements that carry a punch, right? They little short statements that give me a lot of meaning that I can chew on for days. So I love that. And I hope you do too, because the Proverbs are absolutely amazing. It's fascinating to me that the same man who was inspired by the Spirit to write Proverbs is the same man who was inspired by the Spirit to write Ecclesiastes. But he wrote it at two different times in his life. So the Proverbs are accumulated very early in his life, up through probably the middle of his life. And Ecclesiastes is accumulated right at the end of his life. And he is looking at the end of his days. Because God has already told him at this point that he has been weighed in the balance and found wanting, and that his days have actually been shortened, and that the only reason the kingdom is going to remain united until after his death is because God made a promise to his father. Solomon is so grievous in his sin that God only allows the kingdom to stay united because of his promise to David. Not anything to do with Solomon himself. In fact, in spite of what Solomon has done, God allows him to keep the kingdom intact until his death. So all that kind of laying the groundwork, because this is a momentous, and again, this is what we cover in surveys, the momentous movements in the Old Testament. And this is going to signal a dramatic change in the makeup of the nation of Israel. It will be divided, and it will stay divided from this moment forward that we're going to look at this evening. So let's talk about what happened to Solomon. How does this man who asked God for wisdom, that God gave wisdom to judge and rule over his people, how does he get to the point where he looks around at life and says that everything is grievous to me? Everything I have done up to this point, everything in life is just grievous and burdensome, and nothing has meaning. Where did he go wrong? Well, let's work our way through. We're going to look, and on your little note page, rather than putting everything on there and just overwhelming you, I gave you the large chunks. So we're going to look at large chunks, and we're going to be looking at books, 1 Chronicles chapter 28. We're going to be looking at quite a bit there. We're going to be looking at 1 Kings 11. We're going to be looking back a little bit, just very quickly, at Deuteronomy 17 for the rules for kings. And we're going to be looking at 1 Kings 12 to explain how bad things got. And then that will kind of help you to go back and review some of the things we talk about tonight. Because I'm going to hit you with the fire hose of verses. It's going to be too much to drink. I just want to show you that the things are there. And then we're going to draw some summaries and explain what happened to Israel and why it happened the way that it did. And then you can go back and review everything we cover tonight by reading these larger chapters and reading them in their entirety. Also want you to notice something, that the Chronicles and the Kings overlap one another, much like the Gospels do. You know how Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John cover a lot of the same historical events? So do 1st and 2nd Chronicles and 1st and 2nd Kings. So if you really want to study an Old Testament event during a king's life, like, say, Solomon's, you're going to want to look up the historical narrative in the Kings and the historical narrative in the Chronicles, and then put those together. You'll get a much fuller picture of what actually happened in their life. So we're going to pull these things together tonight out of both Chronicles and Kings that apply to Solomon and the division of the kingdom. So let's go back to the very beginning for Solomon when he becomes king. We're going to go back to 1 Chronicles chapter 28, and that's where this historical narrative is found. We're going to start in verse 5. So 1 Chronicles 28, verse 5. This is David talking. Of all my sons, for the Lord has given me many sons. David had a lot of sons. He has chosen my son Solomon to sit on the throne of the kingdom of the Lord over Israel. So David was aware, because God had made him aware, that of all of his sons, Solomon would be the one who would take his place when he died. And he said to me, says, God said to me, your son Solomon is the one who shall build my house and my courts. For I have chosen him to be a son to me, and I will be a father to him. So this is God's promise to David. This is who he's talking to. David and God are talking back and forth, and God makes it very clear that Solomon is the one to take his place when he dies. He's also made it clear to David that his time is about finished. He's about accomplished everything that he can accomplish, because God's already told David he would not allow him to build the temple because he was a man of war, and there was a lot of blood on his hands. He had killed a lot of people in combat. And God wants someone who has not got blood on his hands to build his temple. And he has chosen Solomon to be not only the king, but also the builder of the temple. And then he tells David, and I will treat him like a son, and I will be his father. So that's a great and tremendous promise that he's giving to David for Solomon. He says, I will establish his kingdom forever if. So listen to what God tells David. He says, now when Solomon takes your place, I'm going to let him build the temple. I'm going to be with him, and I will establish his kingdom forever if he resolutely performs my commandments and my ordinances as is done now. Now, was David a perfect man? And the answer is no. There are no perfect people. But what David was a dedicated servant of God. He was truly a man of faith. And he, according to this, did everything that he could to obey the commandments and ordinances of God, and to lead God's people to join him in doing so. I love this passage. Most people miss this at the end. Let me read it to you again. I will establish his kingdom forever if he resolutely performs my commandments and my ordinances as is done now. Well, I hope God gives me a compliment like that, or I hope he says something to me like that when I'm done, right? Well done, good and faithful servant. You've worked right to the end. Come on home. That's what he says to David. I know you've done this. You have been dedicated. Now, if Solomon is as dedicated as you are, if he strives to keep my commandments as you have, and he leads the people to do the same, then I will establish his kingdom, and it will endure. So now in the sight of all Israel, the assembly of the Lord, and in the hearing of our God, so this is David, observe and seek all the commandments of the Lord your God, so that you may possess the good land and bequeath it to your sons after you forever. So now, this is David relaying to Solomon this message that God had given him already, and commissioning Solomon to follow in his path, to obey the commandments of God, and to lead God's people to obey God's commandments as well. Then we jump down, very next verse, verse 9. As for you, my son Solomon, know the God of your father and serve him with a whole heart and a willing mind. So you need to know the God that I have served, the God I have been faithful to, and the God that I love. And you need to love him the same way, and you need to be faithful to him as I have been. For the Lord searches all hearts and understands every intent of the thoughts. If you seek him, he will let you find him. But if you forsake him, he will reject you forever. So he lays it out for Solomon. You have been given this tremendous opportunity. You have been blessed in an amazing way. You have this great opportunity to go forth and finish the work that I started, to build the temple that I have been saving for and accumulating material for. And if you follow in my footsteps and are faithful to God, he will watch over you, he will protect you, and he will make your kingdom great. But if you forsake him, he will reject you forever. And this is David's instruction then to his son, according to what God had shown him. So this is all Solomon has to do. And what's really fascinating about this is David had already done the heavy lifting. Samuel and then David after him had driven idolatry out of Israel. They had destroyed the temples, they had torn down the altars, they had burned the groves. There were very little, if any, vestiges of idolatry in Israel by the time David dies. He has gotten rid of it. He has been diligent and done what God commanded. That's why God could say of David, it is actually my will and my word that's being obeyed now, right now. So this is what Solomon walks into. He walks into a united kingdom. Most of their enemies have been subdued. David had subdued Philistia, which is the Philistines. He had also subdued the Amorites and the Ammonites. He had subdued just about everybody. Everybody had been defeated because God had been with him, and God had delivered the enemies into his hands. So the kingdom is pretty much at peace. There is no war. Idolatry is gone. It's been erased, and everything is running pretty well. The people are united. Everyone's come together after that little rebellion led by one of his other sons. And the kingdom is in a really good place. And God's ordinances are being obeyed. His commandments are being followed. And God is pleased. Solomon, all you got to do is walk in and build that temple. I've even collected the money for you and the material. A little side note, I don't have the verses for this, but did you think Solomon built the temple first, or did he build something else before he built the temple? He built his own house. It wasn't good enough to live in the palace his father left him. He built himself a bigger palace before he built the temple of God. So right there, you can kind of see the difference between he and his father. Even some of his initial actions, although not malignant necessarily, they do show a difference in priority. Whereas for David, God was number one. It becomes very obvious early on that Solomon, it's not that clear cut with him. He does want to serve God, I believe, especially at a young age. He really does want to be a good ruler at a young age. And then life happens, doesn't it? And the true nature of the heart is exposed. So moving on then, let's move to, where are we going to move to? 1 Kings. So we start out in Chronicles. Let's move to 1 Kings. Let's go to chapter 11. We're going to read the first couple verses, and we'll read a few verses in 1 Kings chapter 11. So 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 1 says, Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women from the nations concerning which the Lord has said to the sons of Israel, you shall not associate with them, nor shall they associate with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after their gods. Solomon held fast to these in love. So almost immediately he begins to marry. And he begins to marry the exact people God said for him not to marry. And look at this list. He marries a daughter of Pharaoh, a woman from Egypt. He marries a Moabite, an Ammonite, an Edomite, a Sidonian, and a Hittite. All idol worshipers. That's what they have in common. Everyone come from people who worship idols. Every one of these tribes are tribes that God commanded not only that they should not marry into, but they should not even associate with because of the danger it would pose to their faith to God. It would cause them to be divided in their allegiances. So they see this, he doesn't really pay attention to what God has commanded. He more follows the desires of his sinfulness. So he desires women, so he begins to marry women. And always he begins to marry women, he begins to marry women that he's actually been commanded not to marry. So we see that in verse 3, this really ramps up through the early years of his life. By the time we get a total towards the end of his life, he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives did exactly what God warned they would do. They turned his heart away from God. He became so consumed with meeting the needs and the wants and the expectations of his wives that he, at the end of his days, had no time to serve God. Now, I don't know about you. I can do the math on that. That's over 1,000. No wonder the guy wrote Ecclesiastes. And it's not because the difference between male and female. How would you like to have 1,000 husbands, ladies? You think you'd write Ecclesiastes too? This goes both ways, doesn't it? This is just an overwhelming amount of responsibility. Your heart would be pulled in so many different directions. Can you imagine the jealousy and the envy that was just probably common in his household? He never went anywhere where he didn't get confronted by, well, it's about time you showed up. You know, it's probably been 2 or 3 years. This is just a no-win situation. And for all the excitement of youth, that wears away very quickly, and you're left with the disillusionment of middle age. And his more so than normal. He is just not in a good place. And this is the reason. Not only that, but he's rebelling against God. He's ignoring the commandments of God. He's the wisest man when it comes to ruling people. And yet he begins to just chuck that wisdom aside. He becomes very unwise in the way that he rules people. He asks God, by the way, because people talk about his wisdom, he asks God for a very specific kind of wisdom. He asks God for wisdom to rule his people. He wanted to be a good and wise king. But he doesn't even follow that for very long. For a while he does, and he makes good decisions, he makes good judgments, but then he quickly begins to cave into the desires of all these various wives that he has, and he begins to do what they want rather than the wisdom that God has put in him would direct. And he begins to make very unwise decisions. And then we see that next. If you remember, we talked about last week, I think it was the rules for kings, because God knew they would ask for a king. And even while Moses was alive, he had Moses write down the way kings should behave if they ever got to the place where they had a king. Like Deuteronomy 17:16, I'll read it again. Moreover, this was a commandment that kings could not break. These commandments were just commandments for kings. He shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never again return that way. So there's a couple reasons why this commandment was given to kings. The biggest one is they were not to go back to Egypt for help, because God was to be their help. Second thing, chariots and horses were the tanks and helicopters of their day. And God did not want his people, specifically his king, that would serve under him, he did not want that person to depend on his own military might. He wanted the king, just as then the king should lead the people to do the same, he wanted the king to depend on him, to turn to him to overcome their enemies. Do you think Solomon paid any attention to that? Well, we've talked about this before. No, he didn't. 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 26, now Solomon gathered chariots and horsemen, and he had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen. How many did David have? It's not very many. I don't remember the exact number, but it's in the single digits or less. He has a few chariots that are more for show than anything else. They're not really, and he doesn't really appear to have any cavalry of significance. Very small number, maybe for scouts or something like that. So David depended on God to lead his people into battle, and David depended upon God to deliver him the victory. Solomon has a slightly different approach. He begins to build a massive army for a nation his size. 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen is significant military force in that time period. He stationed them then in chariot cities and with the king himself in Jerusalem. Now don't miss that last part. Where is the military power centralized? Now David, when he was king, the military was spread out among the 12 tribes because they still held their own tribal affiliations. And whenever David needed to go to war, he would send out the call, and a certain number from each tribe would come together to form one united army to actually deal with a particularly tough enemy like the Philistines. But then they went back home, and what they were able to accomplish at home was to secure their own borders. Where is this massive army located primarily? Jerusalem. Jerusalem. And who are they with? Him. What happens to all the other tribes? They're no longer going home. They're now a standing army where David would put out the call and people would come and they would fight until the fight was finished, and then they would go home. These people aren't going home anymore. He stations them in chariot cities, and historically we know the chariot cities were built sort of in an arc around Jerusalem, and then the rest were stationed in Jerusalem itself. So what he did was he built a massive army, contrary to the commandments of God. He centralized his power through that army, and then he himself was insulated by the army. And the rest of the people were on their own. You figure it out, guys. You're on your own. I've already taken, we'll get in that moment. He'd already taken the best and strongest, and then he kind of just left them. And these people no longer went home to defend their own homes and their own regions. Verse 17, the rules for kings, he says, "He shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away, nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself." Well, we already covered the one about the wives, right? But the second one, did he accumulate gold and silver for himself? Well, yes. Ecclesiastes 2:8 tells us, which we've already, actually we didn't read it, we skipped it, but Ecclesiastes 2:8 tells us that he accumulated gold and silver for himself, and he did it in violation of the rules for kings. Because not only did he accumulate gold and silver, he accumulated massive amounts of gold and silver. Probably to make his wives happy, if I was guessing. Chapter 11, verse 4. "For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David his father had been." And so because of all this, his affection for his wives, his desire to please them, he began to give in to them and their wishes, and he began to not only allow them to worship idols, his heart begins to drift towards idols as well. And so no longer is heart wholly devoted to the Lord as David's heart was. Verse 5 in 1 Kings 11, moving on down. And we could go through all the king's rules. I'm not going to tonight because he broke all of them. He broke every one of the king's rules, and that's just an example, though, of at least 3 of the 5 that he broke. So 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 5, "For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians," and here's where we get the record of him beginning to not just allow idols, but he begins to worship them himself. And that's what the term "went after" means. He began to give his devotion and his worship to these. And there's a whole list here. Solomon went after the Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and did not follow the Lord fully as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable idol of Moab. So we have Milcom, Ashtoreth, and Chemosh, 3 idols of the surrounding nations that he either is worshiping or building temples or high places for. On the mountain which is east of Jerusalem, and then he adds Molech, the detestable idol of the sons of Ammon. Molech probably rings a bell, doesn't it? Hey, you're hearing a little chatter about old Molech today, aren't you? Well, if you're into conspiracy theories, you are. But Molech has been worshipped for thousands of years in various forms. Molech is the god, little g, who demanded the sacrifice of children in exchange for prosperity. So if you were willing to sacrifice one of your children, usually an infant, that was the preferred mode, you would then receive some form of reward that would lead to prosperity in your life, either job opportunities or an influx of wealth. But that's the reason Molech was so popular. People really bought into the idea that if you offered a child to Molech, that Molech would then reward you with immeasurable wealth. So again, you can kind of see the appeal for someone like Solomon, who's really caught up in this idea of accumulation of wealth and building power and centralizing it in himself. Notice how God describes this particular idol. He says he's detestable. Molech is the detestable idol of the sons of Ammon. So another god from the Ammonites. Thus also he did for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. And don't miss the significance of those last four words. If he's accommodating the worship of Molech, the worship of Molech requires child sacrifice. So if they are sacrificing to their gods, not only did he bring idolatry back into Israel, he also brought child sacrifice into Israel. Verses 9 and 10. Now the Lord was angry with Solomon. Can you imagine that? Is anybody shocked by that one? No, I'm not shocked by that one. The Lord is extremely angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. The significance of this is overwhelming. Solomon was blessed, established, came into a wonderful situation. Idolatry's been cleaned out of Israel. Israel's at peace. They have no real enemies that threaten them in any significant way. They are wealthy and strong. His father has accumulated everything that's needed to build the temple, so that all Solomon has to do is come in, build the temple, and reign and rule wisely. God has promised him and visited him twice with promises that he would be with him and establish his kingdom forever if he would stay devoted to God. And you can read those accounts, you can look those up, and you'll find them where God spoke to him and dealt with him directly, not just through David, his father. So God in these had commanded him concerning this thing that he should not go after other gods. And so again, just as David had warned them, God warned him not to go after idols or other gods. But he did not observe what the Lord had commanded. So again, we get this same over and over again, him not paying attention to what God has said. So the Lord said to Solomon, verse 11, because you have done this, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. So this is where God makes it clear to him, because with all these appearances and all these warnings, Solomon has continued down this path of sin. He's refused to repent. He's refused to obey. He's become more and more jaded over time. He's no longer dedicated to God. In fact, he's probably more dedicated to his wives and their gods than he is to the living God who put him on the throne in the first place. And now he tells him, well, I'm going to take the kingdom away from you. Verses 12 and 13, nevertheless, I will not do it in your days. But why? I said this earlier, for the sake of your father David. So Solomon, you've messed up. You've done exactly the opposite of what I've told you. Because of that, I'm going to take the kingdom away from you. I'm not going to do it during your lifetime out of respect to David. I love your father. He loved me. I made a promise to him. I will keep that promise. But I made a promise to you that was contingent on you being obedient, and you have not been obedient. So I'm going to tear the kingdom away from your household at the end of your life. So that's what he goes on. He says, I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. So he's going to allow the son to remain, and this is where you're going to get the southern kingdom, and all the other tribes are going to move up and be a part of the northern kingdom. So this is where Judah comes from, and then Israel is what's left over in the north. And all this is what God promised to Solomon would happen if he didn't keep the commandments the way David had kept the commandments. So he's going to linger on, sort of a lame duck king, if you will, until his death, because God has completely rejected him because of his sin. Even though he was greatly blessed, he squandered all of his tremendous blessings. And in the meantime, his people suffered. And that's what leads to the divided kingdom. The first part is very clear. God's going to tear it away, and that's the part that matters the most. But what happened during Solomon's years on the throne was that most of the people began to despise him. And it's not really hard to figure out why they despised him so much. 1 Kings 12:4. We'll talk about what brings this to come. We'll talk about what causes this to happen after we look at what happens. So after Solomon dies, his son takes over. And this is the cry of the people to the new king. Your father, who is Solomon, made our yoke hard. So what the people are crying out for is relief. They're crying out to the new king, Solomon's son, and they're saying, your father has made our lives extremely difficult. Now, therefore, lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke, which he has put on us, and we will serve you. So this is what they say to the son. We actually want to stay united. We want to serve you as king, but you got to back off a little bit because we are suffering under the burden your father has put upon us. And then he goes on, and if you jump down to verse 11 in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 11 says, Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam on the third day, as the king had directed, saying, return to me on the third day. The king answered the people harshly, for he forsook the advice of the elders which they had given him. So even the elders agree with the people that Solomon had placed too heavy of a burden upon God's people, and that they were basically suffering under the burden. And they agreed that the new king should back off and give them relief from the burden they've been bearing. And he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men, saying, my father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. And how well do you think that went over? Not very well. And so then we get verse 18. King Rehoboam sent Adoram. So King Rehoboam would be the king of the southern kingdom. He's Solomon's son. King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was over the forced labor. Notice what he was in charge of, forced labor. And all Israel did what? Stoned him to death. And King Rehoboam made haste to mount his chariot to flee to Jerusalem. Now in your chart I gave you, it's going to show you who the king of the northern kingdom would become. A man named Jeroboam will be the king of the northern kingdom. Rehoboam will be the king of the southern kingdom, of Judah. At this point, Israel is split in half. And what starts is a period of civil war that was either hot or cold, depending upon the time that you study it. But they are a divided kingdom. They are no longer unified, and they don't even really have an agreement to come to one another's aid if one or the other is attacked. So there's some real animosity here between the people of the northern and the southern kingdom. So when you're reading historical narratives from this time forward, when you read Israel, you're just talking about the northern kingdom. When you read Judah, you're just talking about the southern kingdom. So it's very important as you study the Old Testament moving forward, you understand the difference between the two. But again, what was the burden that Solomon placed on the people? Well, it's just a little bit of common sense. You can figure out what the biggest problem was. The biggest problem was taxes. He basically taxed the people into poverty. Because what happened was exactly what God told them would happen. God told them, if you get a king like the other nations have, then what that king is going to do is he's going to come to you and he's going to take your children. He's going to take your young men to go into his army. He's going to take your young women to work in his homes, his palaces. And what is often missed was that the system God set up, where God was the king, was the perfect system. God was the king. He was the protector and the provider for his people. They didn't need a large standing army because God fought for them. And that's all they needed. They could defeat anyone. But yet, he warned them, if you establish a man as king, he's going to want a large standing army. What did Solomon do? He built a large standing army. Now, when you have, and we don't even know how many infantry he had, probably 4 or 5 times what he had in cavalry and chariots. If you have the number of cavalry and the number of chariots he has, let's say that it takes about 20,000 because the chariots take more than one, and each horse takes one. He had 12,000 cavalry. So he has 20,000 or more cavalry and charioteers. And then he probably has at least 4 or 5 times that in infantry. That was typical of their day. So he has somewhere between 80 and 100,000 in his standing army. Now, number one, he built cities for them. Is it cheap to build a city? It's never been cheap to build a city. It wasn't even cheap in his day to build a city. But he built cities specifically for his army. And what happens when you have a standing army? You have to feed them? Sure you do. How do you feed them? You tax the people. That's how you feed them. And it's not just enough to tax the people, because this is not the days of today where you can just pull out a pizza and toss it in the oven. Everything has to be prepared, and it takes a lot of labor to prepare food for 100,000 men and their families. Because guess what else they have? They also have wives and children. And so he has 100, 200, probably 300,000 people living in these cities just for the military alone. So then he has to conscript all their young women and even more of their young men to come and work his fields and to tax the people and collect those taxes, bring them to Jerusalem, distribute the food out, prepare it, and feed the army. So what happens to all the other people? Well, what happened to all the other people was, because he's doing so many building projects, he taxed them to take care of his army. He taxed them to finance his building projects. He taxed them to feed the people who were working on his building projects. And on it went until the people were completely impoverished. He took so much that the people had very little to feed themselves with. And then when that didn't work, because he still didn't have enough workers, he started to beat them in order to get them to work harder. Because what happens when you take everything away from people for yourself? What do they not want to do anymore? Work. Which, this is beside the point, but let me tell you why communism doesn't work. Let me tell you exactly why communism doesn't work. If you take everything away from a person, you take away their motivation to work. And once you take away their motivation to work, guess what sinners don't want to do anymore? Work. So what do you have to do then? And study communism. We studied it in college back when I went to college, when we still actually looked at things and actually thought deeply about things. But what happens when nobody wants to work anymore? You have to motivate them to work. And how do you motivate them to work? You either starve them or beat them. Guess what Solomon did? He did both. He starved his people, he beat his people to motivate them to work, because he had taken everything away from them and they lost their motivation to work. That's what you get. So you have all of this just crushing down on these people. They have lost everything. Everything has been taken away from them. Their freedom has been taken away. Their wealth has been taken away. Their land has been seized, and their children have been conscripted into the army of the king. And what did God tell them would happen? That very thing. That's exactly what God told them would happen. So taxes literally crushed them, then forced labor angered them to the point that they rebelled against the new king. And why didn't they rebel against Solomon? Well, God was the one that held that back. Because God said, I will let you stay on the throne because I promised your father David. And then I will take it away. So from this day forward, and you can see the division then between Jeroboam and Rehoboam, where we read the little encounter where Rehoboam makes his threats, and then the people of the north respond by killing those that he has sent to enforce their threats. And so what's happened now is you have a divided kingdom. In the northern kingdom will go one direction, and the southern kingdom will go another. The problem for the northern kingdom is going to be that their initial king, Jeroboam, is not a good man either. He's just an angry man. Because what Solomon did was he produced anger amongst his people. Jeroboam is not a servant of God. He's not really a very pious man at all in any way, shape, or form. He's not a faithful man. He's a man who sees an opportunity and he seizes it. He goes into a position of power, and then he abuses it as well. He's also basically infatuated with idol worship, just as many in the southern kingdom are also. So you have this whole issue going forward where you have an angry people who become angry at each other. And we see this in our world today, this idea of anger and animosity and jealousy and envy. So the northern and southern kingdoms then become angry with one another. They become jealous and envious of one another. All of this, if you go back and really think about it, and if you go back through these chapters that I've given you and you read them in their entirety, All this comes about because a tremendously blessed man who was given wisdom to rule people, who was given incredible amounts of material things, and one challenge: to be obedient to God, to use that wisdom to serve God by leading his people wisely, to use that wealth to build a temple for God so that God could be worshiped and the sacrifices could be offered in a place that would be fitting to God himself. All of this had been prepared and handed to him, but instead of doing that, he went out to live his life for fun. And that's why Ecclesiastes, to me, is kind of the hinge of the Old Testament. It kind of takes everything that came forward, and it takes this man, this one individual man, who's been put in this tremendous position of opportunity. It takes this one man, and everything swings in a different direction. And if you read Ecclesiastes, he tells you why. He tells you why, and it's truly a sad story. He sets out because he's bored. Read it. He sets out because he's bored to experiment, to see if he can find a little excitement in life. If you read those first couple chapters, there's no mistaking this. It's clearly what he states. And what he finds instead of excitement is depravity. And then when he reaps the consequences of depravity, he finds that life is meaningless. And isn't that the tragedy of our day? The tragedy of our day. The problem is, he does this and he leads the people to do it with him. And the young men are compromised because they follow in his footsteps. And you see this in the way the young men reacted when the people cried out for relief. Instead of seeing their fellow countrymen and having pity on them and convincing the king to give them a little relief, they're like, let's just double their burden. And if they won't do what we tell them to do, let's beat them into submission. Also what? That we can find a little excitement by pursuing worldly things. So Solomon, it explains his 1,000 wives. He's looking for excitement wherever he can find it. His accumulation of gold and silver. His building of multiple houses and tremendous houses he built. Not just small houses, but tremendous houses. And we see this. If there's anything, Ecclesiastes should speak to us today as we watch the deterioration of our world. Because people are looking for a little excitement. Let's go out and find the meaning of life in pleasure. You're not going to find the meaning of life in pleasure because the only place to find the meaning of life is God. And keep in mind, this man, God visited twice. And he still didn't find the meaning of life in God. Yeah. Truly a tragic tale, isn't it? It's truly a tragic tale. But it does help you understand the Old Testament, because now you better understand the wisdom books. Ecclesiastes is written by a man inspired by the Spirit to record for us what happens when you give yourself up to the pursuit of pleasure. When that becomes your only ideal and the pursuit of your life, this is what happens. And then it also brings everything sort of to a conclusion. And what I often look at is sort of the first half of Israel. And then the second half are these up and down periods where you have kings who are good, kings who are bad. And you have the wrath of God hovering over Israel this whole time. And the prophets then come and speak to God's people to repent. That pretty much is their message. The message is repent, stop worshiping idols, return to God himself. And then you have God turning his people over to foreign nations as a form of chastisement to drive them to repentance. And that really is the rest of the story. It really is the rest of the story. So next week we will start, no, not next week, because next week's Easter. We won't have any Sunday night service. Next time we get together, which will be a couple of weeks actually, we will look into this cycle. And once you see the cycle, the rest of it all kind of falls together. And when you survey the Old Testament, you begin to see the ebb and flow and the up and down. All right, so let's close in prayer, and then we'll be dismissed this evening. So let's pray. Father, we thank you for another day that you've blessed us with. We just pray that you continue to be with us, watch over us, guide us, direct us, and keep us in the center of your will. And Father, I just pray you would be with each one. Help us each to grow in our understanding of Scripture. Help us to not make the same mistakes Solomon made. We do live in a world that